9 waves have crashed upon the shore, 9 waves have crashed, and 9 waves more since the days of which we speak. Days when a great cloud of mist descended upon Slievenarun, the iron mountain in what these days is called County Leitrim. For 3 nights and 3 days the mist was so thick that wolves could not see their paws in front of their faces. And then, on the dawn of the 3rd morning, the mists began to dissipate, and there in all their splendid glory was revealed the ancient gods themselves. The Tuatha De Danann had arrived and set foot upon Irish soil. And so, as the mists vanished, they set forth, some to the north and some to the south, some to the east and some to the west, and some remained within the centre. About their tasks they went, and one such was the great burly, bearded giant of a god known as the Dagda. Off he strode about the land until he came to a mighty hill, a hill held sacred by the peoples of Ireland that were already there, the Vabolog. And upon this hill was an enormous ancient oak tree, as broad in girth as the Dagda himself was broad in girth, as thick of limb as the Dagda himself was thick of limb. Ancient and mighty and strong, these 2 beings were as kindred souls. And the Dagda reached out and placed his hand upon the trunk of the ancient oak. And from the clear blue sky there came a great thundering peal, and a bolt of lightning descended and split the oak in 2. And there the Dagda took one half of the oak, and shaped and fashioned it into a club, and the thick rough end of this club, which was as hard as iron, at the merest brush, the merest touch, would deliver somebody unto death. And the thin end of the club end which the Dagda himself held on to, the merest touch of that upon a corpse would restore the corpse to life. And the other half of the split tree he began to whittle and shape and plane and twist and turn until it was made into the most beautiful, magnificent, carved, jewel-embossed harp that anyone had ever clapped eyes upon. And he strung it with threads of red gold, although there are some who say that it was not metal thread, but hair plucked from his own beard, which was itself the colour of flame, and stretched the length of the harp frame. But whatever it was, that harp, Wathna, played such music as few are ever blessed enough to hear. It was a wonder, it was a beauty to behold. And off about the world he went. Now, having told you that there were already a people in Ireland when the Tuatha arrived, the gods went to them, the Vabolog, the people of the earth, the people of the mountains, and said to them, "This land is huge and great and green and fertile and beautiful, and there are very few of you, and there are very few of us. Shall we not divide this land between us? Shall we not share like for like?" And Shreng, king of the Vabolog, said to his people, "If you give them an inch, tomorrow they will want a mile. We shouldn't give them nothing, share nothing. This land is ours, and ours it will remain." And so the people came to blows, and blood was shed, lives were lost, and to make a long story short, at the end of it, Nuatha, king of the Tuatha, severed the head of Shreng, but not before, if only a split second before, Shreng had severed the limb of Nuatha, and so he lost his hand, and his kingship was lost with it, even as the war was won. And in the terms of the peace treaty, the Tuatha took 4/5 of the land of Ireland for themselves, and the Verbolg, who had been offered half and refused half, must settle for the remaining 1/5 of the provinces of Ireland. And for some time, under the leadership of a new king, peace reigned in Ireland. The gods set about expanding the land, reclaiming soil from the seas, sowing forests, causing lakes and rivers to spring forth where there had only been dry land before. They shaped and formed the terrain and expanded the land of Ireland until it became bigger and grander than it had been on the day when they arrived on the eve of Beltane, the start of summer. But the peace did not last, as is always the way. Peace never lasts and war never lasts. All things turn and all things change. And so there came the time when the peace of the Tuatha itself was threatened, not by the Verbolg, but by somebody else entirely, by a peoples who had been living in the ocean depths, the children of the goddess Domnu, goddess of the deep, dark abyss. They awoke and they slithered up from the darkness at the bottom of the ocean bed, and they broke the surface of the waves and looked upon dry land with envious eyes. And they were a strange peoples, scaled and fanged and clawed, some with webbed fingers and some with tentacles, some with one eye, some with 10 eyes. They were a strange-looking peoples. Perhaps all those generations inbreeding at the bottom of the ocean trenches. But on to the land they came, raiding parties, seizing cattle, seizing slaves, murdering and burning and raping and pillaging as they went. They attacked Verbolg and Tuatha without distinction between the two peoples. And soon there came to be war. Not merely raiding parties, but full-on war, as the people of the land realised that the people of the sea would not back down or back away from their ruthless ambitions. And the day came when the two great fierce armies met upon a great plain dotted with 100 or more standing stone pillars, that was called, because of those pillars, Moitura, the plain of pillars. And there, day after day, in the heat of the midsummer, they clashed and they fought, they battled, they bit, sword and axe, spear and bow and lance, tooth and fang and claw and tentacle, ripping and tearing, hacking and slashing, blood spluttering into the soil of Ireland, Tuatha blood and Vermori blood and Verbolg blood alike soaking the soil. Night after night the armies retreated, battered and bruised and injured and grieving, to their respective camps. But it came soon to the notice of the king of the Vermori that each morning, when the Verbolg returned to the field of battle, they came fresh and fierce and courageous, burning bright and bold, not battered and bruised and heartsore and battle-weary the way the Vermori were, grieving their losses. And the king of the Vermori would know why it was. What was the secret? What was the magic of these people that they should face battle day after day as if each day was their very first day upon the battlefield? And so he sent his stealthiest spy to slip and slide between shadow, from nook to cranny, from corner to darkness to light, in and out of the forests, in and out of the tents of the Tuatha encampment, watching and spying by day and by night, until he came back one day with his report to the king. And he said to the king of the Vermori, "What I see there is that each morning the troops awake, and they gather in the centre of their many, many tents in their encampment. And there, men and women and children alike, they sit upon the soil, and the Dagda sits upon a tree stump and places his great harp in his lap, and he begins to play and pluck upon the strings of the harp, and sings with such ferocity, such passion, such throttle, songs of war and songs of battle, songs of ancient times and the lands from which the Tuatha came from, that all of the warriors are fired up and passionate and full of vigour and vim, and they stride forth into battle, raging and burning as we see them each morning. And each evening, when the moon rises and the sun goes down into darkness, and we return to our camps bloodied and battered, and they return to their camp bloodied and battered, the Dagda gathers the sick and the injured and the wounded and the grieving, and they sit once again on that same soil at the heart of their encampment. And the Dagda once again sits upon his tree stump with his harp in his lap, and he begins to pluck upon the strings and sing, not with passion and fury, but songs of sadness that makes the heart weep until there is no grief left. Songs of longing and yearning, of joy for peace and for home and for happiness. Songs of praise of the fallen. Songs of laughter and joy, until by the end of it, each warrior falls into a deep, restful, healing sleep, such that when they awaken in the morning, their bruises have faded, their cuts have healed, their wounds are resolved. And his magic is greater even than the magic of the healers, who go from wounded soldier to wounded soldier, tending them with ointments and unguents, with spells and with charms. For no matter how great their magic, the Dagda's magic is greater still. Truly he is, as they claim, the chief of all the Druids. Well, hearing this, the king of the Vamori decided that this harp should be treated as a weapon of war, not a mere instrument of entertainment. They should retrieve it, acquire it for themselves. Even if they knew not the magic of how to make it work, at least they could deprive the Tuatha of its benefits. And so the very next day he ordered his troops to fight with singular ferocity, to stage attack after attack after attack, unrelenting in its passion and its vigour, as a distraction, to keep all of the Tuatha troops focused on the battlefield and thinking of nothing else. And whilst all of this was going on, and the carnage was horrific, a chosen band of the stealthiest, the sneakiest, the slimiest and slitheriest of the Vamori made their way into the Tuatha camp. And the only people left in that camp were those too injured, too wounded to go into battle, the young and the very old, and the healers set to tend their needs. All else who could stand, man and woman alike, were on the battlefield. And of course those healers were far too busy rushing between their patients, stitching wounds and applying ointments and unguents and chanting spells and feeding them and watering them, to notice shadows slipping between trees, betwixt tents, entering in to the accommodation of the Dagda and sneaking out again with a harp underneath their arm. At the end of the day, as the moon rose and the sun fell, the two armies retreated to their respective camps, and the Dagda arrived back as battered and body-sore and heart-sore as any of the other warriors. But rather than resting, he swigged down a great goblet of mead, strode into his tent, and reached for his harp upon its stand, only to find nothing, no harp. And at once he began to suspect what had happened, but he summons the healers and asked if anyone had moved it to clean it or something, and nobody had, and of course he knew then that it must have been stolen. And after a lot of roaring and thundering and swearing so vile it made the very earth quake, He called for aid. Who amongst the soldiers, the warriors of the Tuatha, would accompany him in quest for the harp? And most were too exhausted, too injured, too soul-weary to do anything, but two volunteered. Ogma, the wise, the learned, the ancient, bald and grey-bearded, offered to help. And Lu, bold and bright and youthful, and filled with unbounded energy that not even day upon day upon day of battle could quench, he offered to help find the missing harp. And so the three of them, by moonlight, set out to stalk, to hunt, to search, to quest. Like trackers following the footprints of a deer, so they followed prints in the mud, they followed bent twigs, dislodged birds' nests. Here and there they went, following the signs that party of oh so stealthy Fomorians had quite unwittingly left behind them. Until at length, after many a mile of travel, they came upon an ancient castle, built by the ancestors of the Bolog and long since forgotten and abandoned. And they could see the flicker of firelight through the windows. They could hear the roar of song, not the beautiful, harmonious songs of the Dagda, but the raucous, cackling, screeching voices of the Fomori, raised in cries of triumph. And they, almost as stealthily as the Fomori spies, approached the windows of the great castle and peered in. And there they saw the tables of the old castle set with feasts, boar and deer and wolf and bear, fish of every description unimaginable laid upon the feasting tables, some of it cooked, some of it raw, and there the Fomorian warriors and wizards and lords and ladies gathered around the tables, eating, slobbering and slurping and gulping and squelching, farting and belching, ripping apart meat with claws and fangs and tentacles, feeding their faces in an orgy of gluttony. And there, on the far side of the hall, opposite the doorway, sat the harp upon a stand. His harp. And the Dagda's heart beat with fury to be so deprived of his beloved harp, to have his precious, precious harp taken from him by these upstarts. "Let me think," said Ogmar, the wise and the learned. "I will come up with a plan whereby we can slip into the hall. Perhaps we can climb upon the roof and go down into the hall and take the harp. Let me think, let me think." And Lu, full of fire and vim, said, No, I will cause a distraction. I will draw the Fomori out of the hall, and they'll chase me for mile after mile after mile, and while they're chasing me, you too can slip into the hall and then take the harp." And the Dagda said, "There is a more simple way." And he strode to the great doors of the ancient hall, and with a mighty kick pushed them off their hinges, and off they went flying hither and yon into the crowded feasting hall, where silence fell in shock to see this great bearded giant standing in the shattered doorway. And in an ancient tongue, which I dare not tell you, for I would have to kill you if I did, he summons the harp, and I can but tell you the English translation. "Come, harp, come, come, harp of summer, come, harp of winter, come, harp of spring, come to my hand, four-sided oak, come to me who shaped you and formed you." And the harp, shaking and quivering, leapt off the stand and flew like a great mighty eagle across the hall. And as the Fomoris jumped up trying to grab the harp out of midair, the harp smashed one skull after another, after another, after another, and before it landed in the Dagda's hand, 9 Fomori lay dead and bleeding upon the flagstones of the ancient castle. And the rest stood in mute shock and horror and surprise at what they had seen, but only for a second or two, before they reached for swords and for spears and for axes and for cudgels. And Ogmar said to his friend the Dagda, "We must come up with a plan." And the Dagda said, and he began to strum his fingers upon the harp. Strum and strum and strum. And he began to sing the Gentre, the baldiest of baldy songs. A song so rude, so torrid, so graphic in its descriptions that every last man and woman in that hall roared with laughter, laughed until the swords and the spears and the axes and the cudgels dropped from their grip and clattered to the floor, laughed until their sides were aching, until the tears were slipping down their faces, until their underwear was damp with the laughing. And at length the sound of the final note died out, and even Lugh and Ogmar were holding their sides with laughter and aching at this juncture. And for a few brief minutes everyone in the hall heaved and struggled to even stand up. They were so breathless from laughing at the rudest song they had ever heard in their life. But stand up they did, and they once again reached for club and spear, for axe and for sword, until the Dagda began to pluck again upon the strings of his beloved harp. And he sang a song of such sadness. He sang the Goltree, the grief song, the heartbreaking song, a song of all that is lost and will never be found again, a song of grief, of lost honour, of lost love, of lost joy, of lost life, of lost everything. And the tears began to flow. The women pulled their shawls about their hair in the ancient sign of mourning, thinking of all that they had lost, of brother, of husband, of son, of father, all who had lost in the battle. The men began to weep and to sob for all that had been lost, not only in that battle, but through the whole courses of their lives lived in the darkness of the ocean depths. And they wept so many tears they could have filled the gullies at the bottom of the ocean bed. Even Ogmar and Lugh were sobbing by the end of the song, until at length the final note died away. And for a few minutes everyone was too shaken to move, too heart-racked, too grief-stricken to do anything, but only for a few minutes. Until at length they began to stir their stumps again and reach for their weapons, and the Dagda began to pluck upon the strings of his harp for the third and the final time, and sang the Sontree, the lullaby, a song intended to put babies to sleep, but a song so potent, so magical in the voice of the Dagda and in the music of the harp strings, that even adults felt their eyelids grow heavy. Whether they had one eye or two, 3 eyes or 10, they grew heavier and heavier and heavier. And the music was like the flakes of snow in winter that fall upon the earth and put the land into the deepest of sleeps. Until, as the final note of the harp song died away, all that could be heard in the hall was snoring. Deep, deep snoring. The whole hall plunged so deep into sleep they would not awaken for a week. And indeed the Dagda had to shake Ogmar and Lugh awake, because they too had succumbed to the spell of the harp. And the three of them, two yawning heavily, the third with a great big broad smile upon his bearded face, strode across the land back to the encampment of the Tuatha. And the Dagda once again played his concert for the injured troops, sang to them, healed their wounds, soothed their souls, and when they awoke again upon the next day, he sung to them once more the songs of war and courage, and fierce they went into battle against an army now much depleted, for half their troops, their king included, lay asleep in a castle somewhere off. and so in due course the battle was won, and the Dagda never again from that day to this day has been parted from his harp.